Hey everyone, today we are going to cover chapter 7, which is photosynthesis. Before we start with that process, I do want to mention that it's really important you understand how chapter 6 cellular respiration works because it is very similar to photosynthesis. Before we start with that process of photosynthesis, let's talk about how the plant anatomy looks like. So here we know that plants have leaves, and then on those leaves we have what's called mesophyll tissue. And then this tissue has an abundant amount of chloroplasts, organelles. And then chloroplasts are the sites where photosynthesis takes place. And then on the leaves, what you have are these tiny pores or mouths called stomata. So stomata is plural, and then stoma is singular. So here you have one stoma, but together you have two stomata. And then what these little mouths allow for what to happen is gas exchange. So we know in photosynthesis, the plant will intake carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that carbon dioxide goes, from the outside into the mesophyll, into the chloroplast, and the photosynthesis takes place. And then as a byproduct, it will produce oxygen gas that will be released from a stoma into the atmosphere. Okay, so that these little mouths, these little pores will allow for these two gas exchange. And then, is sometimes it may be easy to confuse which gas goes in and out, but as long as you know that, carbon dioxide for the plants, that's what they love. And then the oxygen that they make is for us, is what we love. And then what does this all have to do with global warming? Well, what's happening with global warming is that a lot of carbon dioxide is being released by the things that we do, humans do. Whether you think it's a conspiracy or not, but we see it in our everyday lives that our climate is changing. Whether we're driving a car or our industry with these tall stacks releasing the carbon dioxide. A little bit of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is okay, that's normal. But when you have 7 billion people on this earth and then we're all doing these things that are releasing an exorbitant amount of carbon dioxide, what happens is that our atmosphere will increase in temperature. And then even 1 degree temperature change is dramatic. So what that does is that it melts these ice caps that these polar bears depend on for hunting. They use it as a hunting ground to hunt seals. And now if they don't have these anymore, they are most likely to starve. And then these polar bears, they're swimming from ice cap to another ice cap, which are very, very long distances. And polar bears aren't, they're not meant to swim. They're not very great swimmer, especially if you have a mama polar bear with her cub or cubs. Those cubs will most likely not be able to make it from one ice cap to another ice cap. So that's one of the things. And another thing that we're contributing to global warming is that we are cutting down trees to make agricultural industry, housing, and then when you cut down trees, well, that limits the amount of photosynthesis that can take place. If essentially what you're doing is you are limiting the amount of carbon dioxide that the plants can get rid of to release oxygen. We need these plants to get rid of these exorbitant amounts of carbon dioxide. So if you ever get a chance to watch any documentaries on global warming, I would suggest it just to open up your mind and, kind of see what's happening, what scientists are thinking, and, people all across the world is thinking. Okay, so let's get back to our chloroplast anatomy, the anatomy of the plant. So we know that chloroplast is an organelle. It's such an important organelle that it has a double phospholipid bilayer. So that means that it has an outer membrane right there, and it has an inner membrane. So what organelle do you remember has a double phospholipid bilayer? It is the nucleus. Okay, and then inside your chloroplast, you have these membranes called thylakoids. Thylakoids. And then the stacks of membranes, these stacks of thylakoids are called a granum. A granum. And then on the outside, you have this fluid-filled space that is called the stroma. So don't get stoma, S-T-O-M-A, and stroma, S-T-R-O-M-A, mixed up. So stroma is in the chloroplast, is this fluid-filled medium. That is where the sugar is made. That is where our glucose is actually made for the plant during photosynthesis. Okay. So let's go back to this thylakoid membrane. So here we have another picture of a thylakoid. These membranes, they have embedded in them these pigment molecules, okay? These pigment molecules, especially chlorophyll, what they do is that they absorb sunlight energy to start the process of photosynthesis. And then here, it used to, it was believed that the oxygen that was produced by photosynthesis came from carbon dioxide. Okay, so remember, carbon dioxide is a reactant, so is water. And then we have our products. Here we have glucose, water, and oxygen. This equation is a very, very important equation, but essentially if you remember the equation for cellular respiration, is kind of like the opposite, where here you have 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and of course we need sunlight energy, and then photosynthesis will produce 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. Okay, so these oxygen molecules, it was thought that it came from carbon dioxide, but scientists radioactively labeled the oxygen atoms, and then they discovered that the oxygen molecules actually came from splitting water. Splitting water. Splitting water, hydrolyzing water, breaking down water to produce oxygen gas. So we've heard of electromagnetic energy, but what is it really? Okay, so electromagnetic energy, or sometimes we hear it as radiation, is just the sunlight energy and how it travels through space. The way that it travels through space is in these waves, these cycles. And then one wave or wavelength is what we measured in, is from one crest to another crest. So the crests are the top part of the waves, and then the trough is the bottom part. So one wavelength will be from one crest to another crest, and it'll include one trough. And then these are measured in nanometers. And then we have something that's called the electromagnetic spectrum, which will include visible light. These are the wavelengths that we can see. These are the colors that we can see, whereas other wavelengths we cannot see. And then we've heard of these wavelengths before. So we have our radio waves all the way to our gamma waves. But let's talk about what makes waves dangerous, or has a lot of energy or has little energy. So imagine if here, this is 1 second, this is 1 second. So if something that has a long wavelength, so here's one wavelength, and then here's another wavelength, and here's another wavelength. So we have essentially maybe 3 to 4 wavelengths passing through, or 3 or 4 cycles passing through 1 second. That's not that much energy. The frequency is not that much. However, if we have a short wavelength, where here this is one wavelength, and then this is another wavelength, well, in the span of 1 second, we will have more wavelengths that pass through. We would have more cycles that pass through. So essentially, this would have a higher frequency and have higher energy. whereas this wavelength has less energy. So let's correlate the frequency with how much energy um, we see in our everyday lives. So radio waves, they have a longer wavelength. So right here, so that means they have lower energy, which makes sense because we are always surrounded by radio waves, and then we are okay. Our health is relatively okay. And then here we get to microwaves, which has a little bit shorter wavelength, which a little bit higher energy. Okay, so we try not to stand in front of the microwave. Um, Try not to stare directly in front of the microwave. Here, infrared, and then of course here, UV rays, which have shorter wavelengths, so they have higher energy than these radio waves. And we know that UV rays are harmful to our skin. It can damage our DNA. When you're going to the doctor's office, whether it's to the dentist, and then you have to take some x-rays for your teeth, and then they put this lead apron on you. Well, that's to protect you from the x-rays, these shorter wavelengths, these higher frequencies of waves that have higher energy. And then of course, you have your gamma rays. But in between here, you have these wavelengths that we can actually see, that are visible to our to the human eye. And then right here, red. Red has a longer wavelength, so it has a lower energy. Purple or violet, whatever color you want to call it, it has a shorter wavelength, about 380, but it has higher energy. So what can happen to light when it hits an object? Well, there's three things that we're going to discuss in this class, but there are more things that can happen when light can hit an object. But the three things that can happen are reflected, absorbed, and transmitted. So these are the three things that you're going to be responsible to know on the exam. But of course, you can have refracted as well. So what happens is that the reason why things happen when light hits an object, it depends on what the object is, what the frequency of that object is, and the frequency of the light, the wavelength of the light. So if they don't match, then they could be reflected or transmitted. But if they are in the same range, they can be absorbed. So what happens in photosynthesis is that these light wavelengths are absorbed by our pigment molecules. But if they're not absorbed, they can be reflected or they can be transmitted through. And transmitted through is most likely happening to when light hits a transparent object, or when, here when light hits an opaque object, it gets reflected. So why are chloroplasts green? Why do we see leaves as being green? Well, what's happening is the wavelength that is responsible for the green color, it is being reflected. It is not being used by photosynthesis, where the other wavelength colors are being used by photosynthesis. So if green is not being used, it's being reflected. It's kind of like if I'm wearing a red shirt. What can happen to light when it hits an object? There are many things that can happen to light, but the three things that you guys need to know for this class, for this exam, is that light can be reflected, absorbed, or transmitted through. But there are many other things that can happen, such as light can be diffracted, it can be refracted, it can be scattered. But these are the three things that you guys will need to know for the exam. Okay, so it all kind of depends on the object, the frequency of the object, and the light frequency. If they are similar, then that means that the light energy would be absorbed. Okay, but if you have an object that is transparent, most likely the light is going to be transmitted through. That light energy is just going to be transmitted through. But if the object is an opaque object, then that light energy is just going to be reflected off the object. So let's think about that. So why do we see chloroplasts as green or leaves as green? What color is being reflected so that it can come to our eyes and then to our brain and we perceive that color green? Well, it's the green color that's being reflected, and all the other colors are being absorbed. And then it kind of leads to the question, what happens on a hot summer day like today if you wear an all black shirt? Well, all that light energy is just going to be absorbed in that shirt, and then that energy turns into heat. So you actually get hotter on a summer day if you wear a black shirt. Whereas if you wear a white shirt, a more opaque shirt, what's going to happen to all that light energy? It's going to be reflected. So that light energy is going to be reflected, and it doesn't turn into heat, and then you won't feel hotter. So you'll feel less hot or even cooler. And then, red objects. So let's say if I'm wearing a red baseball cap, why do you perceive it as red? Because it's that red wavelength that's being reflected off my hat, and then your eyes will send that information to your brain, and then you see it as red. So there's many players to photosynthesis that are involved in photosynthesis. You have your chlorophyll pigments, which are pigments that will absorb the sunlight, and you have something that's called carotenoids that is also a pigment molecule that absorbs sunlight energy as well. And then here, your chlorophyll A, that's the primary pigment molecule, or we say antenna molecule, that will absorb sunlight, and it's the one that directly participates in photosynthesis. Whereas you have your chlorophyll B and your carotenoids, they are called accessory pigments, and they indirectly participate in photosynthesis. But why do we have all these different pigments? Well, it's because we can have more of a spectrum of wavelengths to participate in photosynthesis so that we can get more energy in photosynthesis to occur. And then this is just the list of the colors that each pigment reflects and absorbs. So carotenoids, it has a very special feature. called photoprotection. So if you imagine on a hot summer day, well, all that sunlight beating onto the leaves, being absorbed into these thylakoid membranes, it does need some kind of protection from all that excessive energy. So what carotenoids do is that they will absorb that energy and dissipate it. So that energy doesn't react with any oxygen molecules and in turn destroy any of the tissue or any of the chloroplasts or thylakoid membranes. And then it's these carotenoids that you see in the fall season or autumn season. It has that yellow, orange, red color. So you see during the fall season, your chlorophylls, which reflect the green, these pigments, they will start to break down, but it's your carotenoids that you will see in the fall. Okay, so let's get started with our photosynthesis process. It's comprised of two stages called the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. So first of all, the light reaction, it happens in the thylakoids, these thylakoid membranes. So remember, they have these pigment molecules embedded in them that will absorb the sunlight energy. Water will come into play. And then what we get as a byproduct from the light reactions is oxygen gas. Oxygen gas. But the point of the light reactions is to make ATP and another type of coenzyme called NADPH. Now, each NADPH will carry 2 electrons and 1 proton. And then this ATP, this NADPH, is actually used to power the Calvin cycle. So your ATP and your NADPH that's made from the light reactions, they are going to go into the Calvin cycle to generate glucose. And then, of course, you have your carbon dioxide that will come into the Calvin cycle that will also help to make your sugar. That's where you'll get your carbon molecules to make your glucose. And then all of this happens in the stroma. So remember, the stroma is that fluid-filled space inside the chloroplast surrounding the thylakoids or granum. And then sometimes it's called the dark reactions, just because it doesn't need sunlight to actually occur. But you do need the products from the light reactions, which does need sunlight. So this Calvin cycle can keep going as long as it has ATP and NADPH. But it'll stop and then wait for the light reactions to generate more ATP and NADPH. So ultimately, you have this sugar or glucose that can be used for cellulose, the plant cell wall, starch, cellular respiration, because remember, plants have mitochondria, so it can make ATP. And then you can also make other organic compounds such as lipids. So that is the gist of photosynthesis. So here, this light reaction, before I start with this chapter, it goes into a lot of detail about photosynthesis. You really don't need to know what photosystem is, light harvesting complex, reaction center. So whatever's in your lecture notes and what we talk about is basically what you need to know for the lecture exam, okay? So here you have this complex here that's embedded in the thylakoid membrane. And then in this complex, you have these pigment molecules, or called antenna molecules. And then what they do is that they absorb energy, solar energy from the sun, and then they pass that energy around. So they pass that energy from one pigment molecule to another molecule, to another molecule, to another molecule. So these pigment molecules get excited, and then they pass that energy to another one. Ultimately, they pass that energy to a special pair of chlorophyll A. So to this special pair of chlorophyll A. And then so now this molecule gets excited and its electrons are in a higher state. So now this special pair of chlorophyll A will donate its electrons to a primary electron acceptor. Primary electron acceptor. So let's look at it more in detail. So you have in the thylakoid membrane, so see how it's a phospholipid bilayer. Here, just imagine if this thylakoid membrane goes all the way around, okay? And then you have two complexes that will absorb sunlight. And then in each complex, you have these pigment molecules that will get energized from the sunlight, and they pass that energy around to each other. And then ultimately, this energy gets passed to that special pair of chlorophyll A. So here's the special pair of chlorophyll A. And then it gets those electrons excited, and then this special pair of chlorophyll A donates or passes its excited electrons to the primary electron acceptor here. But now the special pair of chlorophyll A is missing electrons. So it needs to be replenished with electrons. Where is it going to get the electrons? Well, it's going to get the electrons that's missing from water. When water gets hydrolyzed, it donates its electrons. When water gets split, it donates its electrons. And then you get the formation of your oxygen gas. Oxygen gas. So here, let's get back to where our electrons are currently. They have been donated to the primary electron acceptor. And then this primary electron acceptor donates or passes these electrons to a short mini electron transport chain that's embedded in the thylakoid membrane. So kind of just like cellular respiration. So here the electrons come to this mobile electron carrier. Nothing really happens. And then the electrons go to this protein that spans the membrane. And what do you think is going to happen? So what's going to happen, just like in cellular respiration basically, is that these electrons are going to energize this protein to pump hydrogen ions or protons from the stroma into the thylakoid space. So now you're generating a higher or a high concentration gradient of hydrogen ions. So now that that's happened, you've pumped protons from the stroma into the thylakoid space. Now the electrons are going to go to this peripheral protein, mobile electron carrier, and then to here. But remember, as this is happening, for this complex, it's absorbing sunlight energy as well, these pigment molecules, and it's passing that energy around to each other, and then ultimately to another special pair of chlorophyll A. And then what do you think that the special pair of chlorophyll A is going to do with this excited electrons? It's going to donate these excited electrons to a primary electron acceptor. And now the special pair of chlorophyll A is missing electrons. So it's going to replenish those electrons from the electrons that came from the electron transport chain, not from water. So now you have this primary electron acceptor with this excited electrons, and then it's going to go to this mobile electron carrier, and then ultimately is going to combine with NADP plus and a proton to become NADPH. So it'll carry 2 electrons and a proton. So here we're creating more enzymes that will carry electrons and protons. And then the NADPH that is made from the light reactions is going to go to the Calvin cycle. Okay. But what about this high concentration gradient of protons that you just made, that you just pumped from the stroma into the thylakoid space? What do you think is going to happen with those protons? Well, just like cellular respiration, this represents potential energy. So it's going to energize the enzyme ATP synthase to make ATP. So protons are going to be pumped from the thylakoid space through ATPase back into the stroma to make ATP. So essentially, you've carried out chemiosmosis to make ATP, just like cellular respiration. And now this ATP that you've generated is going to go into the Calvin cycle. And then the Calvin cycle makes the glucose. And the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma. So for chapter 7, it's not going to be as difficult as cellular respiration, chapter 6, just because you don't exactly need to know how many molecules of each goes into the reactions or how many molecules of the products. You just need to know what type of molecule and are the reactants, what type of molecule are the products. So now we are going into the Calvin cycle that occurs in the stroma. And then sometimes this Calvin cycle is called the dark reactions, just because you don't directly need sunlight to proceed. You just need the products from the light reactions, which are ATP and your coenzyme NADPH. So what happens in this Calvin cycle is that you have one molecule of carbon dioxide. So this is going to represent your carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide is made up of only one carbon molecule, one carbon atom. So this carbon dioxide goes into the Calvin cycle where it'll meet up with an enzyme called ribisco enzyme. And then there's a molecule waiting for it in the Calvin cycle called ribulose bisphosphate, abbreviated RUBP, so ribulose bisphosphate. And then what this enzyme does is that it'll combine this molecule of ribulose bisphosphate with carbon dioxide, essentially fixing it, combining it to become another intermediate in this Calvin cycle. And then so this Calvin cycle will undergo some other intermediate molecules. But this first step is really the only step that you guys will need to know for the exam. But it's always good to read the textbook to know what the other 2 steps are. So this first step that we just talked about, where ribisco enzyme combines carbon dioxide with ribulose bisphosphate, is called carbon fixation. And then so in this cycle, the plant is going to use ATP and NADPH as a source of energy to make those intermediates so that we can generate glucose. And then remember, glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. So if glucose is a 6-carbon molecule and you're putting in only 1 carbon dioxide per cycle, how many cycles do you need to make 1 molecule of glucose? I'll give you guys a minute. So you'll need 6 molecules of carbon dioxide to make 1 molecule of glucose. Because glucose is 6 carbons and carbon dioxide is only 1 carbon, so you need 6 cycles of this carbon dioxide. 6 cycles. And then ultimately, you can use this glucose to for starch, cellulose, and other things, other organic molecules. So this is generally what happens in the Calvin cycle, but feel free to use your book to learn more in depth about it.